Okay, the second part of Piglet catches a Heffalump. Some hours later, just as the night was beginning to steal away, Pooh woke up suddenly with a sinking feeling. He had that sinking feeling before, and he knew what it meant. He was hungry. So he went to the larder and he stood on a chair and reached up to the top shelf and found nothing. That's funny, he thought. I know I had a jar of honey there, a full jar full of honey right up to the top, and it had honey written on it, so that I should know it was honey. That's very funny. And then he began to wander up and down, wondering where it was, and murmuring a murmur to himself like this. It's very, very funny, because I know I had some honey, because it had a label on saying honey. A Galoprius, full up to the top, too. And I don't know where it's got to. No, I don't know where it's gone. Well, that's funny. He had murmured this to himself 3 times in a stinging sort of way, and suddenly he remembered. He had put it into the cunning trap to catch a Heffalump. Oh, bother, said Pooh. It all comes around to be kind to Heffalumps. And he got back into bed. But he couldn't sleep. The more he tried to sleep, the more he couldn't. He tried counting sheep, which is sometimes a good way of getting to sleep. And as that was no good, he tried counting Heffalumps. And that was worse, because every Heffalump that he counted was making straight for a pot of Pooh's honey and eating it all. For some minutes he lay there miserably, but when the 587th Heffalump was licking his jaws and saying to himself, "Very good honey, this. I don't know when I've tasted better." Pooh could bear it no longer. He jumped out of bed and ran out of the house and ran straight to the 6 pine trees. The sun was still in bed, but there was lightness in the sky over the 100-acre wood, which seemed to show that it was waking up and would soon be kicking off its clothes. In the half-light, the pine trees looked cold and lonely, and the very deep pit seemed deeper than it was. And Pooh's jar of honey at the bottom was something mysterious, a shape and no more. But as he got nearer to it, his nose told him that it was indeed honey, and his tongue came out and he began to polish his mouth, ready for it. "Bother," said Pooh, as he got his... Oh, excuse me, too far. "Bother," said Pooh, as he got his nose inside the jar. "A Heffalump has been eating it." And then he thought a little and said, "Oh, no, I did it. I forgot." Indeed, he had eaten most of it, but there was a little left at the very bottom of the jar, and he pushed his head right in and began to lick. By and by, Piglet woke up, and as soon as he woke, he said to himself, "Oh," and then bravely, "Yes," and then still more bravely, "Quite so," but he didn't feel very brave. For the word which was really jiggering around in his brain was Heffalumps. What was a Heffalump like? Was it fierce? Did it come when you whistled? And how did it come? Was it fond of pigs at all? If it was fond of pigs, did it make any difference what sort of pig? Supposing it was fierce with pigs, would it make any difference if the pig had a grandfather called Trespasser W? He didn't know the answer to any of these questions, and he was going to see his first Heffalump in about an hour from now. Of course, Pooh would be with him, and it was much more friendly with 2. But suppose Heffalumps were very fierce with pigs and bears. Wouldn't it be better just to pretend he had a headache and he couldn't go to the 6 pine trees of this morning? But then suppose that it was a very fine day, and there was no Heffalump in the trap. Here he would be in bed all morning, simply wasting his time for nothing. What should he do? And then he had a clever idea. He would go up very quietly to the 6 pine trees now, peep very cautiously into the trap, and see if there was a Heffalump there. And if there was, he could go back to bed. And if there wasn't, he wouldn't. So off he went. At first he thought that there wouldn't be a Heffalump in the trap. And then he thought there would. And as he got nearer, he was sure there would, because he could hear it Heffalumping about like anything. Oh dear, oh dear, oh dear, said Piglet to himself, and he wanted to run away, but somehow, having got so near, he felt that he must just see what a Heffalump was like. So he crept to the side of the trap and looked in. And all the time, Winnie the Pooh had been trying to get that honey jar off of his head. And the more he shook it, the more tightly it stuck. Bother, he said, inside the jar, and oh, help, and mostly, ow. And he tried bumping it against things, but as he couldn't see what he was bumping it against, it didn't help him. And he tried to climb out of the trap, but as he could see nothing but the jar, and not much of that, he couldn't find his way. So at last he lifted his head, jar and all, and made a loud roaring noise of sadness and despair. And it was just at this moment that Piglet looked down. "Help, help," cried Piglet, "a Heffalump, a horrible Heffalump." And he scampered off as hard as he could, still crying out, "Help, help, a horrible Heffalump, hoff, hoff, a hellable horralump, ho, ho, a hoffable hellerump." And he didn't stop crying and scampering until he got to Christopher Robin's house. "Whatever is the matter, Piglet?" said Christopher Robin, who was just getting up. "Heff," said Piglet, breathing so hard that he could hardly speak. "A Heffalump." "Where?" "Up there," said Piglet, waving his paw. "What did it look like?" Like it had the biggest head you ever saw, Christopher Robin. A great, enormous thing, like nothing, a huge, big, well, like, I don't know, like an enormous big thing, like a jar. "Well," said Christopher Robin, putting on his shoes, "I shall go and look at it. Come on." Piglet wasn't afraid if Christopher Robin was with him, so off they went. "I can hear it, can't you?" said Piglet anxiously as they got near. "Well, I can hear something," said Christopher Robin. It was Pooh bumping his head against a tree root that he had found. "There," said Piglet, "isn't it awful?" And he held up tight to Christopher Robin's hand. Suddenly, Christopher Robin began to laugh, and he laughed, and he laughed, and he laughed, and while he was still laughing, crash went the Heffalump's head against the tree root. Smash went the jar, and out came Pooh's head again. Then Piglet saw what a foolish Piglet he had been, and he was so ashamed of himself that he ran straight home and went to bed with a headache. But Christopher Robin and Pooh went home for breakfast together. "Oh, Bear," said Christopher Robin, "how I do love you." "Well, so do I," said